Well, hello. Welcome to the About Time podcast. I'm Chris Nichols. And as you may know, this is a series of recorded conversations I'm doing with people whose work has touched my life in one way or another, inspirations, influencers, people I've worked with. And I'm delighted to say that today's guest is Geoff Mead, who fits into all those categories. I mean, Geoff is a storyteller extraordinaire, author of I don't know how many books, but many books, visiting academic in lots of different places, doctoral supervisor and creator of the Centre for Narrative Leadership. So an extraordinary human being who's done so many things. And I'm just delighted to call you a friend and delighted that you're here, Geoff. So welcome.
Thank you, Chris. I'll settle for human being. That's a good enough compliment. And friend. Nice to be
Mm.
here.
And of course, you're also there with Ted, the dog, who is an author in his own right. So
He
if
is
Ted
indeed,
crops up,
yes. Yeah,
we know he's there. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, Geoff, I mean, maybe we could start. I mean, I'd like to do kind of past, present, future, but maybe start by just saying a little bit about what it is you do.
Well, as you said in the introduction, I do a range of things. I am a storyteller. Occasionally, I tell stories as a performer. These days, I'm more of a writer, I think, than a performing storyteller. But my work around leadership, I suppose, is the most significant aspect of my professional work. And I've been around the leadership development field for a long time. I often joke to groups I'm working with that I'm become profoundly uninterested in leadership because it's an abstract noun. I'm very interested in the verb leading. What is it we do? And one of the things that I think we do as leaders, or when we're trying to lead, is we have to make sense of difficult, complex situations with and sometimes for other people. Now, one of the most uh, effective ways of doing that is a well-told story. I don't mean as a performer, but a story or a narrative that makes sense of a difficult situation. So what I do, one part of what I do is I take my learning in that field, which goes back 20 odd years now, into corporations. And I help them at different levels to understand the storied nature of the world we live in and how, as leaders, they might use story effectively and ethically. I call that narrative leadership. And sometimes I work at board level, and sometimes I'm working at sort of middle tier level, sometimes with whole chunks of organizations, um, sometimes often around change. And these days, it's a much more interesting and complex field than it was when I first began. So that's, I guess, the kind of at the heart of my professional work.
This wasn't your longer background, was it? I mean, you came into storytelling somewhere midstream of life. I mean, I can't
I
remember
did.
exactly when. So, how did you even
I
start?
bumped into, yes, I bumped into storytelling. There are two stories here. One goes back a long way. And I thought about this subsequently. And I've realized, James Hillman often says, if you're looking for what is your telos, what is your sense of purpose in life, if you can't quite articulate it as an adult, think back to as a child, what was the first thing you ever wanted to do? And what is that about? And the first thing I ever wanted to do was make stories. At 8 years old, I remember trying to write a story. It wasn't very good, and I gave up for a long time. But the first time I can think of that I actually had an intention of doing something, well, it was about making stories. But as you say, I had another career. It went away. I forgot all about it. And in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, I bumped into storytelling as a phenomenon. And the kind of revival of the oral storytelling tradition was kind of getting off the ground in this country. And I happened to be at a performance. Incidentally, it wasn't by design. I was at a conference on complexity theory and organizational design, which was in its very early days, very sexy amongst consultants and internal change agents. And the organizer of that, someone I think you might know as well, Paul. God, I can't, Paul. Those now come back to me. But the organizer asked two professional storytellers to come and give a performance, and it absolutely blew me away. Uh, to the point I thought, oh my God, what is happening in this room? That they can bring me into a world, they can create and tell a story, simple language, but so vividly that I can almost experience it for myself. And instantly I thought, this has something to do with what I do on leadership or with people around leadership. I didn't know what, but I knew I had to learn how to tell stories. So at the end of the performance, I went up to the performer, one of whom was actually Ramsden, and I said, I have to learn how to do this. And he said, well, I run a school for storytelling. You better start coming. And I started going on weekends and weeks and so on. And eventually, when I left my first career in 2002, I took a sabbatical and I went to the School of Storytelling for 3 months, full time, residential, to learn the craft of storytelling from the inside out. And gradually, then I began to see, experiment and play with, well, what does that have to do with leadership? I know it has something to do with it. And it took me maybe, in hindsight, I would say 10 years to really understand what I was doing and articulate it and be able to invite other people to do it and name it. And in 2007, I co-created the Centre for Narrative Leadership, as you said, which was just a way of bringing interested practitioners together to explore this nascent field.
So I love that description of two things in that. One, the palpable sense that was brought into the room by, a story well told brings you there.
Yeah.
And then the fact that you went and learned the craft, and you said it took you 10 years to understand what you were doing.
Yes, that I think. And I'm forever grateful to those early clients who took it on trust, because when I started knocking on doors and saying, hello, I'm a storyteller, can I help you? Apart from the ruder replies, those who said, well, maybe, we had to kind of work out together what was useful and what wasn't. And I gradually developed a practice, as I say, which I named narrative leadership. But it was, in those days, the field was wide open. It was just starting. If you look now, in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, there have been scores of books written about it, conferences. It's a regular topic on leadership development courses. It's something that I get asked to do. I don't have to say, please, do you need someone? They knock on my door and say, we need some help with this. So it's very much in public discourse at the moment, storytelling. And then about 10 years in, maybe a bit longer, that's when I wrote the book about telling a story, that, about narrative leadership.
Yeah.
And
So when was the doctorate in
mm,
this, Geoff? I mean, your
when was
doc.
what? I did my doctorate in before, really, as this was happening. Yeah, I did my doctorate in the late 90s and early noughties. I graduated in 2002. It took me 5 years as a part-time mature student to do, and that touched on storytelling. It wasn't all about that, but that was an aspect of it. I was exploring it as part of what I was doing, and coming to think about it as well as practicing it as an art, but also thinking about it as what's special and what is particular about story as a form of discourse, and within that, or particularly, what is it about oral story that fascinated me and still does.
I mean, that's led you into doing all kinds of things, which is where our paths have crossed. I mean,
Yeah.
we work together in like for-profit companies on leadership development programs. But we've also worked together on master's degrees and
Yep.
short
Yep.
programs at Schumacher, amongst other places. Do you still do all of those things?
Most of them, I guess.
Yeah.
I go where I'm invited generally. There are certain kinds of organizations that I choose not to work with, but I'm fairly broad. I don't take the moral high ground particularly. If someone needs some help around story and I can find something useful and ethical to do, then I will see if I can do something. one of the reasons I'm so keen on it is it's a way of bringing a more humane and human aspect of ourselves into the system world, which so often drives it out, which drives us into that kind of purposive, logical, rational mind, which is to do with targets and returns on investment, and decisions are made on grounds that would be insupportable if you tried to explain it to your child or grandchild. And I'm not saying that I'm above all that. I'm implicated in all those problems myself. But there is something about the simple act of inviting people, holding them comfortably enough to tell a simple story that shifts the nature of the relationships between people in the room. And I found not only is it powerful in its own right as a form of communication, but actually, much more importantly, it shifts the debate. It shifts the conversation. It invites us in all our humanity to think about issues. And I hope, I can't, necessarily prove that in every case, but my hope is that the decisions that get made around that process are richer, more thoughtful, more considerate of their impact on others. That's a hope. And I think that the very nature of it, this creating a communicative space in our organization where system world and life world come together, is not easy to do, but story can be a powerful way of creating those spaces for people to bring themselves to their work, not just from their role, but in the fullness of their humanity. That sounds rather grand. What I'm actually doing is quite simple.
Yeah. But I
Um,
do love that
yeah,
system world, life world, which I think is, you introduced me to Habermas. Is it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Jürgen Habermas. Yeah,
Yeah. But that, in my experience, there is that tendency of organizations to reduce the language to something very small. And if we want better organizations doing better work and a flourishing world, there's something about having
yeah.
a language and a vision that's big enough to be alive.
Absolutely. And you could say that their story is too small, and part of the work we do is helping them have a bigger story or connect their personal story to the bigger stories. And I think that's my experience in recent times is that there's a realization that these kind of big stories that we've relied on to make sense of the world aren't working very well, aren't reliable anymore. And so people are beginning to grasp that the world, our sense of the world is constructed. That it's not as things are, but as we tell them. So, in a sense, what we do is create these stories about the world, and then we try and live them. And because they're shaky in many places, people are saying, "Okay, so maybe that is a story. Maybe that's not the only way of doing something. Maybe there are other stories we need to live into now." And um, Arthur Frank talks about this notion of narrative wreckage, which I find very profound, at a personal level or at a societal level, organizational level. And when the stories that we rely on to make sense of who we are and what we do break down, we almost don't know who we are anymore. How do we recover from that? How do we recover from narrative wreckage? Um, and I've worked on that at a number of levels with people.
Yes.
I think it's very relevant for our times, really.
And Geoff, so at the sort of individual level, um,
Mm,
it's something I'm familiar with from like my psychosynthesis psychotherapy training. Is it
yeah, yeah,
ultimately is about reclaiming and retelling your own story one way or another.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
and I know you've had a psychotherapy background, I think with metanoia, is that right? But more
yeah.
recently, you've done a master's degree on no, storytelling and personal narrative or something like this.
Kind of, it was called creative writing for therapeutic purposes. Uh, and creative writing can be poetic, it could be a story, it could be a memoir, it could be almost anything. But so, I mean, I came into that, as I said early on, these days I don't perform much of the story. So I write, I create, I write stories and longer stories and shorter stories, and I've written and published memoir. And one of the things that I experienced, if you like, back in the 90s when I bumped into those storytellers, that was one, moment of peripeter, turning the world. Something, oh my goodness, I have to do something about this. And the second time I had one of those connected with story was after my wife Chris died, and I just found myself writing and writing and writing and writing. I didn't know why, but I knew it was helping somehow. And I do have a background. I don't. I mean, I have had therapy. I have worked therapeutically with people. I'm not a therapist, but I trained in Gestalt for many years, and but I chose not to have bereavement counselling. Not because I denied the value of it, but because I had this sense that I needed to write my way through this somehow, and I did. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote poetry, scores of poems. I wrote blogs. In the end, some of that material was collected as a book. Which I wasn't looking to write a book, but people found what I wrote useful and encouraged me to get it published, and that was Gone in the Morning.
Yes.
And then I thought, so I understand that writing is helpful, but I don't quite understand what's going on when I'm writing that makes it helpful. I've got that kind of mind, that I wanted to know, I wanted to understand. And then I was looking around. It had been some years since I did my doctorate, and I was looking around for something around creative writing. What quite was it? And then I came across this master's degree, which was taught by Metanoia, which is why I did my Gestalt training 25 years ago, accredited by Middlesex, taught in Bristol, which is quite close to where I live.
Oh, yes.
So I thought, excellent. So I signed up for that, and I did that part-time. It's a modular course. It was excellent. And it gave me the opportunity to really think about and read into and research into what's going on when writing's going on as a therapeutic practice. And of course, it touches into this notion of constructionism, that writing is one way we can re-story our lives. And it seems to take us somewhere different than talking therapy. But it brought me to a place where I became absolutely fascinated by the way we create our sense of identity through story. You might call that narrative identity.
Yes.
What the academic literature calls it. So I had a passion to pursue that and to try and understand it and to try and apply it to my own circumstances, as a person now in what I might euphemistically call late adulthood. There are challenges around being in late adulthood, which are different from the challenges of midlife, and they're quite sharp and immediate. And I was looking to see, could I take this thing that I was studying and actually learn from it and actually apply it to myself and see what I could do with it. And at the same time, I was beginning to think, okay, so how is narrative identity linked to narrative leadership?
Yes.
How are the stories we tell ourselves linked to the stories that we can tell others and the stories that we listen to in the world? So over the last few years, that's the kind of shift, I suppose, in my work. And I'm looking to develop both strands of that, both personally to invite people into a space to use writing and narrative, if you like, life story writing therapeutically. I don't mean as a therapist, but in a way that can be helpful for well-being, if you like,
Yes.
at the individual level, and also to try and connect up. So sort of mantra I have at the moment is, "Who you are is how you lead," and the old question, "Who do you think you are?" Who do you think you are is probably some kind of storied self. We have a whole bunch of stories that are both explicit and tacit, conscious and unconscious. And if we are asked, who are you? That old Zen trick where you sit on a cushion and someone asks you, who are you? Who are you? Who are you? And the object is to break away from narrative. But it's almost impossible to let go of the idea that we are somehow actors in a story. So if we acknowledge that, what are the stories? How do we come by them? And what I've learned from others and discovered myself is the very power of storying experience is that becomes a story you have. And until you can story it and share it, it's a story that has you. So the first point of agency, even if it's very small, is a separation between self and story. And that means we have to be able to story and story tell, not constantly, but in the right circumstances. Some of these stories that have shaped us, and I'm exploring taking that into the realm of leadership development with people at the
Yeah, I
moment.
love it. I love it, Geoff. And, as I'm listening to it, the parallel between that work and the work I do based on psychosynthesis, in particular, Assagioli's sub-personalities.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
when you write those stories, I would imagine that at times different parts of your personal narrative come out, including some that are very familiar and some that are really unfamiliar and a bit puzzling.
yes,
And
yes, and
first of all,
yeah,
meeting and understanding those parts, and then in some way either integrating or choosing not to integrate them is,
yes,
is really
yes,
juicy.
yes, or reintegrating in a different way in which they're not in the driving seat. So yeah, the connection with subpersonalities uh, is quite strong, really. In the research and writing a narrative theory, there are three main schools of narrative identity. One is North American, Dan McAdams, and that is a kind of a notion of an essentialist self, rather Rogerian, a modernist, if you like, that there is an authentic true self. Now, if that's the ontological position you take, then healing is chipping away false narratives. At the other end of that kind of ontological spectrum, you have um, a constructivist view, and there's work that came out of Australia and New Zealand, Epstein White, which is the self is almost entirely relational and constructed through discourse. But there is no essential self. But that there are hegemonic stories that demand that we behave in certain ways that have been imposed or we have interjected, and that the marginalized stories need space and encouragement to be told. So that's at the other end. In the middle, so to speak, there's a lesser known European school which looks at the self as multifaceted, not unitary, but as a collection of selves, as a collection of voices, if you like, a collection of characters. And at the edge that I've been exploring, maybe not all those characters exist within the psyche. So, so maybe the self is more distributed. And if the self is more of a conversation, an ongoing conversation between these uh, parts of ourselves, then maybe some of those parts could be external. Maybe they are aspects that we connect with other people. Maybe they live in a world of fiction. Maybe they are to be found in the imaginal realm. And I make a distinction here between the imaginary realm and the imaginal realm. Yeah. So that's another, as Chris would have said, that's a juicy edge for me, is
That is a
exploring that
juicy edge. You may,
distinction.
for
Yeah.
listeners of the podcast, just need to say something about what's the difference between those two.
Okay. So the notion of imaginal was described in the West by Henri Corbin, who was a French philosopher, I suppose, and scholar of rather esoteric Sufi literature. We're not going there, but he proposed the idea that there was both uh, the world that we live in and the world that we can imagine, that is a product of our creative minds, but that perhaps, and we need to be careful how we think and talk about this, one might encounter a third realm, which he describes as being between mind and matter. But that it's not, and he was quite a spiritual person. So for the Sufis, that realm was achieved through ascetic practices and prayer and dervish dancing, and the rest of it. However, the fundamental difference he's talking about is that if we somehow enable ourselves to encounter or engage with the imaginal, we can encounter something, so that what we experience is not a product of our minds in the same way, but that we can kind of meet something, as it were, that we couldn't even imagine. So, and one of the things I did in my for my master's dissertation was to explore that very thing. How as a writer might I create circumstances that would perhaps, I stress the perhaps, enable me to experience something of this encountering of otherness through writing. Otherwise I write what I know or what I can imagine. And what is it? But Bakhtin wrote about Dostoevsky that they had autonomous characters. That these characters in the novel, it's like if there's a writer, and I know you write as well, Chris, your stories. Sometimes as a writer, the characters suddenly take over. You don't know what they're going to say, but the characters established a kind of a life in your mind or somewhere in the field somewhere, and they kind of say stuff it's not like hearing voices, but there's a way in which, as you write them, what the character would say comes through you, and you write it, and it's not anything you'd ever say yourself, but that character that you're connected with is like that. So one of the things that I wanted to try and do was to explore that edge. Is how might we? They're all fictions in the sense that they're made, of course, absolutely. But might we enrich our capacity for those kind of makings, those kind of fictions, by seeing if we can create the circumstances which we might just get out of our own way, yeah, and engage with the world slightly differently and see what novelty can come. Of course, we use our rational mind to judge it. We're not talking about, being taken over by other people's voices. We're just simply trying to extend our mind beyond the city walls of the psyche to say, can we somehow let our mind can we invite in in that deep dialogic way otherness, from which something genuinely novel might come. Yeah.
Loving it. Did you say that starting to look at taking this into the corporate world, into leadership development, is the edge now, or is it something you're going to do? Or
it's at the moment it's kind of implicit. It's like, what is the kind of invitation I can give people, and how much time do I have with them, and what's permission do I have, what contract do I have to take with them? So, as a consultant or as a developer, you always have to kind of work at what you're kind of creating permissions to do certain things. So I got an opportunity, I think, in October. I've been invited to go to a retreat center with an old friend to set something up, an explicit invitation to come and explore, and using some of those kind of very gentle, creative activities, just to invite people to get out of their own way, to be able to kind of see themselves and see the world a bit differently, and learn something new. With these kind of questions, it's like, where am I at in my life? What's my passion? What's my potential? What's my purpose? What do I know? What don't I know? What would I like to explore? And what's the tiny bit of the edge that I'm really curious about? In Batesonian terms, what's the difference that might make a difference here? Do I have any sense of that at all? Can I play at that little edge? Can I just turn the trim tab a little bit and see if that turns the rudder and see if that turns the tanker? I want it to be experimental and playful and non-threatening. And it's not offered as a form of therapy. It's offered as something that we all can have the potential to do, which is to kind of, if we have the desire to do it, is to ask some of these profound questions of ourselves and then dwell in them long enough, and with some kind of process that enables us to dwell and be creative with those questions. Otherwise, I think we can just repeat them and repeat them, and we just, we make the groove in the record deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. So we don't want to do that. And the notion of the imagining is that you're not just imagining what you always imagined, but maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something not in the grooves that you're already know.
And my word, the world needs some imagining beyond.
Absolutely. because the grooves,
established
it
groove,
seems
as
that
it
we
were.
are, and I personally, I think it's a reaction to the kind of narrative wreckage that we're in. Frank talks about three kinds of response to narrative wreckage. One is the chaos narrative. You know, nothing makes any sense. To hell with it. It's never going to make any sense. Every man for them, one woman for themselves, kind of thing. The second equals the restitution narrative. And that's really useful sometimes. Like I broke my leg, I can fix it, I'll be fine. But in more complex personal and societal issues, the notion that we can go back to how things were, and that's a very strong impetus around the kind of narratives that are being created. And the third one, which is the more creative one, which is the kind of developmental one, where I am changed, I am different, but I'm okay. I will allow the story to develop. So do we reach for the new story, the potential of what there might be, knowing that we don't know what it is, allowing ourselves to stay in that space long enough for different things to come, maybe exploring, in every way we know how, but it's going to be something we don't know how to do. Do we reach back for what we think we know? Do we simplify and reduce? Do we enrich and complexify? Do we have the courage to do that, to move forward, creating the story as we go? I think those are the big questions for me as a narrative writer, not to offer simple solutions.
So is that, have I given you enough space to talk about what you do and the what next?
I
Because I've got
think
a couple of
so.
other things I
Yeah.
want to ask you about, but
Yeah.
I want
No,
to make
that's
sure I haven't cut
exciting
you
to
off
do. Thank
on
you.
that very important thing,
No, no, no.
particularly the what next.
Yeah. No, I'm very happy to it was very interesting to sort of be asked to articulate it, because you know what it's like. You sit at a desk and you think and you do stuff, and well, I'm not often asked to really a depth sort of just, or given the scope or the invitation to say, well, actually, I think it's a bit like this or a bit like that. So it's very, very helpful to me actually to have the chance to think aloud.
Well, and on a future one of these, you never know, may ask you to come back and say, where are you? Because I'm planning to do this series for a year. So
Right.
maybe,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe,
Yeah.
maybe
Should
before
have
I'm
some more experience
66,
under
I'll
my
ask you
belt
to
by
come
then
back
with this new
again.
work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Marvelous.
But I mean, I'm also asking people on these to say a bit about what's played a really important part in shaping you. And you have mentioned some names, and
Mm,
the initial storytellers and the doctorate. I
mm.
guess would Peter Reason have been a part of your
Peter
doctorate?
was my Peter Reason and Judy Marshall were my professors at Bath when I did my doctorate.
Yeah,
Yeah. So action research has
yes.
been a very significant influence on me. The idea that you can,
And so, Geoff, you did
uh,
so that was your doctorate at CARP,
yeah,
not
yeah,
you do the masters. You were
no, no.
no,
I did the doctorate at CARP, the Centre for Action Research into Professional Practice, which Peter Reason and Judy Marshall set up with Jack Whitehead in the School of Management at Bath, and I came into that about the time I was coming into storytelling. But they were on parallel tracks. They weren't the same thing. I wasn't simply researching storytelling. So I started, I think, in 97 and I graduated in 2002.
so
Yeah.
just as you were going to that very fruitful area,
Yeah.
I was leaving Australia and moving to America to be an investment banker, and my world was
Right.
getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I didn't
Well,
step out
I'm 10
into
years older than you, which maybe,
yeah. I
so,
moved out into first of all psychotherapy and then action research and the masters in the
yeah.
early 2000s. So I had to
Yeah.
join Ashridge before any of this opened up for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. I mean,
Yeah. That was very important. And I think I have I recognize that, like many people, there's some things I can do and some things I do well. But my greatest talent in life has been I'm a great spotter of fantastic teachers. And I have been blessed with that because, since, all my adult learning, I have found somehow the right person, the right place, at the right time. So when I was at Metanoia, which was back in, when did I do that? The first half of the 90s, I did my 5-year Gestalt training. Um, and it was on fire. It was absolutely. Patricia Clarkson was the lead teacher. Sadly, she's passed, but and she was bipolar. But when she was on fire, she was absolutely on fire. And so I had her at her absolute best, and at the peak of something new. And through her, I met Peter Reason. He actually was invited as one of my 3 examiners on my dissertation for my diploma for that course. And he began to wax about lyrical about this new doctorate. Sounds interesting. So gave myself a little bit of a break, and 18 months later I did that, and they were absolutely at the peak of their work. And then after that, Judith Hemming has been a great teacher of mine in the world of constellations, and again finding her at her absolute, peak of her powers. So I think when I see a good teacher, I know it, and I stick with them. Ashley Ramsden, for example, the School of Storytelling, and Sue and Roy, those people are still, great teachers. But I kind of caught a wave at the right time.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Geoff, I'm conscious that we're almost at 40 minutes now. We could probably
Okay.
go on for hours, but I do want to ask you if we'd been able to do this podcast as a walk.
Yes.
Yeah. Where would you like to have walked, and who would you like to have walked with? Because it doesn't have to be me.
Wow. I would have gone on an impossible walk with you and Chris in the Bluebell Woods in Kingston.
Yeah. And you're talking there about, of course, Chris Seeley.
Yeah.
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 Maybe. I mean, one of the things I sadly can't do on this series is have Chris as a guest in person, but I do hope that we can have Chris in lots of different ways, because I imagine lots of the people who are going to join me on here, one way or another,
Yes.
knew Chris, and nobody quite like you knew Chris. So
No. And for people who don't know me or us, we were married, and I was with her, right through until the end of her life. And she was an enormous influence on me in naming, influences. It wasn't simply the influence of a loving partner. Um, she was a fearsomely intelligent person with enormous insight, and she could see and demand from you the kind of the very best of who you were and what you could do in the world. And she didn't stand for much less, really. So I got it close up for a long time, and I look back on those years as years of immense expansiveness of, just curiosity and exploration, experimentation and creation. Many, many influences on me, but it would be wrong of me not to name her as fundamental and probably primary amongst them.
you know, one of the things I remember most after Chris died was you made a journey, a peregrination, I think you called it, which
Yeah, I
me
did.
enormously, and it stayed with me because I went on a pilgrimage after I left Ashridge,
Yes.
which was a walk from place to place with a purpose.
Yeah.
But your
Yeah.
peregrination was called a peregrination because it was slightly different to a pilgrimage. And I can't
Yes.
remember exactly what the difference is, but
Well,
there
in
was
my
one.
mind, I'm not sure this is strictly true, but in my mind, a pilgrimage has a known destination. You are seeking to go somewhere, and it's the journey that counts in a sense, but it's to somewhere, and it's the somewhere that draws you. And when Chris was very ill, we talked about what should I do with you. It's this odd conversation to have, but there was a film that we loved, Martin Sheen's The Way, in which he takes the ashes of his son on the Camino, and I kind of thought, well, that's not me. We never did talk. We never did decide between us what was going to happen, and somehow I just trusted my instincts and I didn't rush. And my peregrination was to go to, and I'm very privileged and fortunate I could do it. I recognize that. But I went to many parts of the world that we both knew and loved, and some that Chris knew and loved that I hadn't ever been to. From Africa to California to New York to Crete to Italy, Ireland, lots of places in England. And I took some of her ashes with me. So, but I realized it wasn't a pilgrimage, but I thought back to the days of the old Celtic saints, and they talked about a peregrination, a sacred wandering. And like the peregrine falcon, I think it's a Latin word, isn't it? It means wanderer, peregrini, they're wandering monks. So I wasn't a monk, but I did have this notion of I wasn't headed for one destination, but I wanted to go where the winds took me. Yeah.
Isn't that nice? The difference between, and they're both beautiful things, but the difference between a pilgrimage and a peregrination is like two different kinds of story. The kind of story that's very plot driven. You know where you are and you know the end where you want to get to, and you write the plot. And a story that unfolds in the writing, and the characters take over, and it goes where it goes. And
yes,
I could. Both of those here.
Yep. I could not have predicted at the beginning, and it was 18 months or so, as you suggested, something of that sort. I didn't know where I go from time to time or place to place. Just whatever, I let the impulse arise. When an impulse arose, I stayed with it, and if it was really strong and I found a way of doing it, then I would do it, and I would try and be fully in that moment with that impulse, and then I'd come back and I'd rest and recuperate and get on with life, and then another impulse would come and think, okay, let's follow that impulse and that impulse and that impulse and see. And as you say, it's a different way of creating a narrative, a story.
I mean, I've no idea how this series is a peregrination, Geoff. I've no idea.
Yeah, lovely.
Where it's going, but I do hope that you might be willing to come back in the future. And do you have any sense of, if you did come back 6 months or 9 months or a year from now on another one of these, where you might be and what you might be doing?
Go on. Well, I think I'm on a cusp of life at the moment myself, but I don't quite know where it's going to go. I don't have a clear direction. I'm curious about what might unfold. I hope that my fiction writing will flourish, and that I'll be finding ways of connecting that creative fiction and non-fictional writing work to this work on story that I do. I'm doing a little bit of that. I'm hoping that I imagine I may still have some doctoral students, although I've had several go through recently, so that may still be in my life. I'm not sure. And I've got a hunch that there are two substantial pieces of writing I want to do. One is theorizing this idea of narrative identity and narrative leadership and the relationship between the two. And I have a book chapter to write about that. So that's going to happen. And I'm playing around with the idea of a piece of creative nonfiction about aging and narrative identity and aging and who am I now as the question, and how might I meet the parts of myself that I need at this time of life. So those are the things that I can see as in the realm of the possible. What the imaginal world has in store for me, I have no idea.
Well, Geoff, I mean, it's just been wonderful talking to you. I'm delighted you could do it, and I hope that you'll.
Thank you.
We might be able to do another one at some point in the future, but I just want to end by thanking you for the numerous points at which you've been an influence on me, and a guide, and an inspiration and a friend. And long may it continue.
Well, I certainly hope so, and let us not give the impression that it's all one-way traffic. I mean, we've known each other and appreciated each other's work for a long time. So this is about the interplay of relationship, I think, rather than this is not Yoda. I'm not Yoda, and you're not a Padawan. So it's lovely this kind of relational process of
Plenty of
learning and
walks and
exploring
enough
together.
wine. So it's
Yeah.
Geoff.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll stop the recording, but I just want to say to everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast. It's been brilliant to be here with Geoff Mead, and there'll be more to come. Thank you all, and thank you, Geoff.
Thank you.